The Pittsburgh Steelers just made a move in the 4th round of the 2026 NFL Draft that's already sparking debate across the fan base, and it's one of those picks that says a lot more about strategy than it does about immediate star power. The selection of wide receiver Caden Weegan out of Iowa isn't about headlines today. It's about roles, identity, and how this team plans to win games in the margin starting right now. Let's get straight into it because this one needs context. Weegan comes into the Pittsburgh Steelers as, first and foremost, a specialist. His immediate role is clear. He's expected to take over as the team's primary punt returner and likely factor into kickoff duties as well. And if you followed his time at Iowa, you know this isn't just a placeholder move. This is a player who was widely viewed as one of the most dangerous return specialists in this entire draft class. That's not a small detail when you consider how the modern NFL is evolving, especially with rule changes increasing the impact of the return game. Now here's where things get interesting, and where some of the tension among fans is coming from. From a pure draft value perspective, this pick feels early. Weegan was ranked significantly lower on consensus big boards, and there were still defensive prospects on the board that many believed could fill more pressing needs. Names like Kyle Lewis, Jalen Kilgore, and Saki Wheatley were still available, and passing on that tier of defensive talent raises legitimate questions about priorities. But step back for a second and look at the bigger picture. The Steelers already addressed wide receiver earlier in the draft by bringing in Jeremy Bernard, who projects as an immediate contributor and likely the team's wide receiver 3. That changes how you evaluate this pick. Weegan isn't being asked to come in and carry the passing game. He's being asked to add a different dimension. Speed, field position, and competition. And that competition piece matters more than it might seem at first glance. Weegan is going to walk into a room where Roman Wilson is currently fighting to solidify his role. This isn't just about depth. It's about pushing everyone on that roster to earn their spot. If Weegan shows what he flashed during Shrine Bowl practices, where he reportedly impressed with sharp route running and the ability to separate in one-on-one situations, then suddenly this becomes more than just a special teams pick. You start to see the outline of a player who could develop into a legitimate offensive weapon, particularly from the slot. He's got the speed to stretch the field and the agility to create mismatches. And if things don't go as planned with other receivers on the roster, the door is open for him to carve out a bigger role than expected. Still, it's fair to call it what it is, a calculated gamble. The Steelers are betting on impact over perceived value. They're prioritizing a player who can contribute immediately in a specific role, rather than waiting and risking losing him altogether. And with Calvin Austin III no longer in the picture, that return specialist role wasn't just a luxury, it was a need. What makes this even more fascinating is how it reflects the team's overall draft philosophy this year. There's a clear emphasis on building a more complete, more competitive roster from top to bottom. Not just stars, but contributors. Not just offense or defense, but all 3 phases of the game. And that's where this pick could age very differently depending on how things unfold. If Weegan becomes a game-changing returner and adds even modest production as a receiver, this suddenly looks like a smart, forward-thinking move. But if the players passed over turn into impact defenders elsewhere, the criticism will only get louder. So now it comes down to you, because this is one of those picks that splits a fan base right down the middle. Do you value the immediate special teams impact and potential upside? Or do you think the Steelers reached and should have addressed other needs first? Because when you look deeper into how this roster is being constructed, this pick starts to connect with everything else the Steelers have done throughout this draft. It's not isolated. It's part of a very intentional blueprint. You don't take a player like Caden Weegan in the 4th round unless you have a very specific plan for him, and more importantly, unless you believe that plan can help you win games right away. Think about the ripple effect here. Field position in today's NFL is becoming more valuable again, especially with adjustments to kickoff rules leading to more return opportunities. A dynamic returner isn't just a luxury piece anymore. It's someone who can quietly swing momentum, flip drives, and create hidden yardage that doesn't show up in the box score the same way passing stats do. That's the lane Weegan is stepping into immediately. And here's the part that shouldn't be overlooked. The Steelers clearly didn't just evaluate him as a returner. What he showed during pre-draft processes, particularly in practice environments like the Shrine Bowl, opened eyes. Reports consistently pointed to his ability to separate, his quickness in and out of breaks, and the kind of speed that forces defensive backs to respect him vertically. That combination gives him a real shot to grow beyond the label of special teams guy. Now layer that into the current wide receiver room. Jeremy Bernard is expected to handle a significant offensive role early, likely stepping in as that wide receiver 3 option. Roman Wilson is still in a position where he needs to prove consistency and lock down his role. And behind them, there's space, real opportunity, and for someone to climb. Weejan doesn't need to be great right away as a receiver. He just needs to be dangerous enough to demand attention. And if he becomes that, then suddenly the conversation changes. Then this isn't about whether the pick was early, it's about whether the Steelers identified a role player who outperformed his draft slots. But let's not ignore the other side of this, because it matters. The decision to pass on defensive talent at this stage of the draft is going to be scrutinized heavily. There were players still available who many viewed as more complete prospects or better fits for long-term defensive needs. If those players go on to become impact starters elsewhere, this pick will be revisited over and over again. That's the risk you take when you draft for role and specialization instead of positional value. At the same time, this front office is clearly leaning into competition across the board. Nothing is being handed out. Every position group is being pushed, and that includes special teams, a phase of the game that often separates good teams from great ones over the course of a season. You can also feel a shift towards speed with this selection. Weejan brings a different type of explosiveness to the roster, and that's something this offense has been trying to inject more consistently. Not just players who can make plays, but players who can change the geometry of the field. Even in limited snaps, that kind of speed forces defenses to adjust. And there's another subtle layer here. Fan perception versus internal evaluation. From the outside, it's easy to focus on draft boards and rankings and say this was a reach. But internally, the Steelers clearly valued what Weejan brings enough to not risk waiting. That tells you something about how they see his role unfolding, especially early in his career. So now everything shifts to execution. Can he immediately stabilize the return game? Can he translate those flashes as a route runner into real production against NFL competition? And can he push enough in camp to make this receiver room more competitive than it was a year ago? Because if the answer to even 2 of those questions is yes, then this pick starts to look a lot different by mid-season. And that's what makes this such a fascinating move. It's not about what it looks like today, it's about what it becomes once the games start. And the more you sit with it, the more this pick starts to feel like a bet on identity rather than just talent. The Pittsburgh Steelers aren't just stacking names, they're shaping how they want to play, faster in transition, more aggressive in hidden phases, and deeper in terms of internal competition. That's what this move signals. Because if Weejan delivers even half of what they believe he can in the return game, you're talking about shorter fields for the offense, more pressure on opposing special teams, and a subtle but constant edge that builds over 4 quarters. Those are the kinds of advantages that don't dominate headlines on Sunday night, but they absolutely show up in the win column by December. At the same time, the door remains open for him to surprise people offensively, and that's where this could really flip narratives. If he becomes more than just a return specialist, if he turns into a reliable slot option, or even a situational deep threat, then what looked like a reach starts to look like foresight. Suddenly, you're not talking about where he was drafted, you're talking about how he outperformed expectations, but none of that is guaranteed, and that's the reality. This is a projection-based pick with a clearly defined floor and a very intriguing ceiling. The floor is a solid special teams contributor who fills a need. The ceiling is a dynamic playmaker who adds juice to multiple phases of the game. Training camp is going to be the first real checkpoint. That's where you'll see how quickly he adapts, how he handles NFL speed, and whether that competition in the receiver room starts to heat up the way the coaching staff likely intends. Preseason will only amplify that. Every return, every route, every snap is going to be under the microscope. And if he flashes early, if he gives fans a glimpse of that speed and playmaking ability, you can already imagine how quickly the narrative shifts. Steelers fans love effort, explosiveness, and players who make an impact in all phases. That's the path to becoming a fan favorite here. And Weejan has a real shot at it, but until then, the debate stays alive. Was it the right time to take him? Could they have waited? Did they pass on more valuable talent? Those questions don't go away. They just get answered over time, snap by snap. So now it's your turn to take it a step further. After hearing the full breakdown, after looking at both sides of the argument, where do you stand today on this pick? And what would Weejan need to show you in his rookie season to completely change your mind about it? Because at the end of the day, that's what this entire conversation comes down to. Trust in the vision versus reaction to the moment. Draft night always creates instant judgments, but the Steelers are clearly playing a longer game here, even with a player who's expected to contribute right away on special teams. What stands out is how intentional this feels. This wasn't a panic pick. It wasn't a random swing. It was targeted. They identified a role that needed to be filled after losing production in the return game, and instead of patching it later, they made sure they got their guy. That tells you they didn't want to gamble on availability. They valued certainty in that role, and that's where the pressure now shifts directly onto Caden Weejan. Not in a negative way, but in a very real performance-based sense. When you're drafted in this range, earlier than many expected, every opportunity becomes magnified. Every return, every touch, every snap, it all feeds into how this pick will be judged moving forward. But there's also opportunity in that pressure. If he hits early, if he gives the Steelers a consistent spark in the return game, he immediately justifies his presence. And once that foundation is set, everything else becomes a bonus. Any production as a receiver, any big play downfield, any chemistry developed with the quarterback, that's where he starts exceeding expectations. And don't overlook the locker room dynamic this creates. Competition doesn't just raise performance, it sharpens the entire group. Roman Wilson now has someone pushing him from day one. Depth receivers know there's no margin for comfort. Special teams units get faster, more dangerous, more accountable. That ripple effect matters more than people realize. At the same time, the front office is going to be judged on the alternative path they didn't take. That's unavoidable. The defensive prospects that were still on the board will be tracked. Their careers will be compared. That's just how the draft works. Every pick carries not just its own story, but the shadow of the choices left behind. So the real evaluation of this decision won't happen today, or even during the first few weeks of the season. It's going to unfold gradually. It'll show up in field position battles, in hidden yards, in moments where a return changes momentum, or a sudden burst of speed flips a play. And if those moments start stacking up, then the conversation changes completely. That's when people stop asking, was it too early? And start saying, this is exactly why they made that pick. So now everything points forward. Training camp, preseason, early regular season reps. That's where the first real answers will come. That's where Weejan begins to define what this selection actually means for this team. And the deeper you go into this, the more you realize this pick is going to be defined by moments. Not volume, not stat lines, but flashes that change games in subtle ways. That's the kind of player Caden Weejan is walking in as. He's not being asked to be the face of the offense. He's being asked to tilt the field, to create chaos in space, and to capitalize on opportunities that most players don't even get. That's why his transition to the NFL is going to be so important to watch early. Return specialists don't have the luxury of easing into the league. One decision, one cut, one misread, it all happens instantly. But on the flip side, one explosive return, one broken tackle, one lane opened at the right time can immediately shift how coaches trust you and how opponents prepare for you. And that's where you start to see the upside of this move from the Steelers' perspective. They're not just adding depth.